Part 1: The Princess and the Poo-Poo. Yeah, I know that the comparison between these two films is strange yet obvious at the same time, because they are simultaneously so different yet so similar to each other. With the Avatar sequel finally coming out after 10 years, this is a wonderful opportunity to prove that Avatar was actually pretty bad, and that Princess Mononoke is by far the superior movie. And we should just watch that instead. Yeah, I know it's cliche to rag on Avatar as a movie, and it's not that original. You've heard it all before. Yeah, the movie had forgettable characters, the story is ridiculously derivative.
Dances with Smurfs was my idea! My idea!
But even back in 2009, when I was a wee lad, it was never the story that bothered me about Avatar. It was the stupidly clumsy way it handled its very serious themes of ethnic conflict, and how it perpetuated a ridiculously childish outlook that really needs to die before more trouble is caused on all sides of real social issues. Yeah, Avatar is just a dumber version of Dances with Wolves in space, but its worldview is actually a serious problem that instigates more tension between very real groups of people, instead of promoting understanding and peace in its outlook. Which is what Miyazaki's masterpiece did, but with better animations. There, I said it. Pandora doesn't look that alive to me, it's a little too clean. If there's anything positive at all to say about Avatar, it's that the trailer for the sequel looks wholesome. And I like the unique family adventure vibe, where a man and his wife and their kids go on an exciting quest. We don't see a lot of that family trope that often. Though I'm betting that anime will still do a better job. Hollywood weirdos can learn a lot from Japanese entertainment. Apart from ripping off cat girl waifus. That's the one thing you took away from them? Are you kidding me? And no, I'm not a weeb. I'm just a dude who can't stand the standard Hollywood schlock no more. Not my fault if the Japanese do a better job these days. Probably because Hollywood is too busy with political activism and child endangerment. I know that comparing these two films, Avatar and Princess Mononoke, doesn't seem like a fair comparison at first. One is sci-fi, the other is fantasy. One is deeply rooted in the Japanese historical experience, where industry and technology disrupts the values of the time and the old way of life in Japan, and the changes it brings to the cultural attitude towards nature, as well as the social norms that leads to the rise of women, etc. While the other is deeply rooted in themes derived from American history, with the Na'vi just being an idealized to the point of caricature version of the native cultures living in North America. And the humans are just a cartoonish depiction of the Anglo settlers, but actually done with less depth than actual cartoons. Avatar also had some Spanish influence as well, with Sigourney Weaver's character being similar to the Jesuits, you know, because they had missions and they taught a European language to the natives and tried to protect them from private interests. Besides all these differences, you have more, you know. One of these films is focusing more on man versus nature. The other is focusing more on the clash of cultures aspect. Though both explore these two themes simultaneously, but they prioritize different ones, right? Also, I'm aware that these two stories have a totally different setting, story beats, plots, character tropes, etc. And the protagonists of each movie are on completely different journeys and go on a different set of character development. So yeah, this would not be a fair comparison to make if it was about which of these is the better story, but that's not what we're comparing here. We are comparing what they have in common, and which one has the better message, and the superior moral to their story. You know, the better worldview, through which we can see our own world, and be enlightened through art and expression, and the magic of creativity. I'm just gonna come out and say that Princess Mononoke is by far superior to Avatar in what they have in common. Not even close. In how they deal with the themes of man's relationship to nature, and the nature of industrial society itself, and of course, controversially, the clash between populations that possess different ways of life. These themes are actually part of a greater conversation. One that is actually very urgent in certain continents, like South America, which is where I live, but it's also applicable to anywhere else in the world, wherever you have industrial society clashing with nature, and with simpler cultures indigenous to the region whose way of life often needs protection from the ever-expanding machine of technological progress. But James Cameron's Avatar does a massive disservice to the conversation by painting one side as completely moral, that goes all like, "You must learn about the colors of the wind, Jake Sully," and then paints the other side as entirely evil, going all like, "Money, money, 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 money," Princess Mononoke actually does the effort to see both sides, and we see how technological development of industrialization can actually be a blessing to young women and people with diseases, who have their lives improved. And Lady Eboshi, the would-be villain from Avatar's perspective, is fully fleshed out as an actual human being with not entirely selfish motivations. She is in the wrong, yes, but her antithesis, Princess Mononoke herself, is also not entirely in the right. And it's not about having both sides fighting each other to the death and making sure that the good guys kill the bad guys like an Avatar, but it's about trying to see both sides and trying to reach a compromise and explain why the conflict is happening in a way that doesn't put the blame entirely on one side. But we'll get deeper into that later. First, we'll have to compare how each of the stories conveys their message, and I promise you that I can prove that Princess Mononoke is healthier and promotes peace between people, while Avatar has a simplistic and extremely divisive message that concludes that the only solution is war or eco-terrorism or some crap like that. Part 2. Self-hating hypocrisy versus love and understanding. Alright, so in Avatar, the humans arrived on Pandora in order to harvest resources, but it was doing that which ruined Earth in the first place. We see Earth as this desolate dying place, and Pandora is this heavenly oasis, full of life, yet unruined by dirty human hands. Right off the bat, we get the sense that humans are a locust plague of sorts. Human civilization is fundamentally irredeemably corrupt. Unlike the Na'vi, who live in perfect balance with the living beings around them, being symbiotic with their homeworld on principle, their philosophical outlook is one that leads to an obviously superior way of life when compared to humanity, because it's sustainable and able to last a long term, and the Na'vi aren't aggressors or invaders, and nothing about them indicates any real flaw as a culture. They are what a 6-year-old thinks of Native Americans after watching Disney's Pocahontas for the millionth time. And I would know, because that's what I did as a kid. I like that movie, by the way. It promotes peace between peoples, unlike Avatar, which is why I hate it when Avatar is compared to Pocahontas. It doesn't deserve such a comparison. The Na'vi have no flaws like real Native American cultures do, who, despite their great virtues and noble aspects, are also normal people, while the Na'vi are too angelic to be real, biological being. The Na'vi don't even invade other tribes of Na'vi as far as I can tell. They live in perfect, utopic happiness. They are completely enlightened as a culture. Even in knowledge about nature and reality, do the Na'vi prove themselves superior to humans. In fact, it is human science, not Na'vi shamanism, which proves limited in the story. And the Na'vi are actually capable of reproducing human technological feats with their knowledge. They can fly in the air, travel long distances. Even the bloody internet and transferring a consciousness from one body to another are all things they are capable of replicating, but without fancy human tech. The only thing they can't imitate with forest magic seems to be space travel. But they don't need it, right? Because they live sustainably, so why would they need to travel to other planets? There is no nuance. The Na'vi are good, the humans are evil. There is no greater context to what is driving the humans to consume resources so voraciously. The only explanation is human greed. The villains causing all the tragedies are just a-holes, that's it. No other greater context is necessary. They want some of that cheddar! And to kill those savages! And that's literally how they talk. I'm referencing real movie dialogue and it's horrendous. Captain Planet had more subtlety. And the hero's journey is one of realization of how superior the Na'vi are. And his character development is fulfilled when he sheds his inferior and sickly, disgusting human form, crippled by his civilization's bad habits, and becomes a mighty Na'vi. The only good humans, aside from dead ones, are the ones willing to betray humanity for the interests of the Na'vi. No one else. One side is completely correct and the other is completely wrong and has to be destroyed by being exiled from the world of life and sent back to their dying world, presumably to become extinct. Not like Jake Silly seems to care.
Whatever happened to becoming one of them and earning their trust so you could explain what we needed?
I was going to, but I sort of hooked up with Natiri instead.
Dude, people are dead!
Compare this utter schlock to the majesty of Princess Mononoke's story. So Ashitaka is a young prince from a culture that lives in a balanced blend of human society and nature, symbolized by his deep and profound friendship to his red elk and mighty steed named Yakul. After a corrupted forest god attacks his village, Ashitaka is forced to kill it, but is infected with the poison of hatred in the process. And this poison of hatred is what turned this divine boar into a raging demon. As a result, Ashitaka himself becomes a threat to his own people because at any point he might lose it and kill others before he himself dies. Kind of like magical rabies. And I would know because I have a bat problem where I live, and I'm just waiting for one of these things to bite me and for me to die a horrible disease with foaming in my mouth. Anyway, where was I? Yeah, so Ashitaka exiles himself from his family and village to go on a quest to be cleansed from the curse. He travels west, and he witnesses the darkness in the world, where he encounters massacres, thieves, government agents disguised as monks, and he learns how everything is transactional in this world. There is little kindness and little respect to spiritual things. Ashitaka later finds the origin of the demon who cursed him, and by doing so stumbles into a totally different kind of war. One between the humans of the industrial Iron Town and the creatures of the forest. And there, Ashitaka meets two ladies who serve as avatars, see what I did there? Of their respective sides, being the embodiment of all they represent. Lady Eboshi represents industrial society, and the titular Princess Mononoke represents animals and living with nature. These two young beautiful leaders of their own realms are caught in a deadly struggle, and Ashitaka realizes that his purpose is not to take a side, unlike Jake Sully, but to try to bring peace and understanding because he sees both sides. I guess what Jake Sully needed was a hot human female on the industrial side. That way he would have incentive to not lead a race war. He'd be like, no, let's be diplomats, let's be gentlemen here, maybe then I can tap those asses. Anyway, Lady Eboshi and Princess Mononoke are both good people with virtues and vices. They represent two different forces, but these forces are not good and evil, but civilization and wilderness, and they have the flaws and good aspects of that which they represent. Lady Eboshi, like civilization, can be warm and comforting to those who would die under natural conditions. Weak people are given a chance to thrive in civilization, but at the same time, it can be cold, calculating, and Machiavellian, and use everyone in its clock-like system, turning everyone into a cog in a greater machine, and diminishing the life around it to make it fit into its mechanical designs. Also, Eboshi allows herself to be dominated by the Emperor and a greater system of which she is herself just a cog in as well. Eboshi is part of this all-encompassing machine that threatens to engulf the world. In contrast, Princess Mononoke, on the other hand, is full of life and encourages the growth of all the life around her. She is untamed and will not be dominated, but she also does not want to dominate. She is freedom. And at the same time though, she is harsh, overly aggressive, and famously unforgiving. Her last line of dialogue is about how she will never forgive. Kinda like my ex-girlfriend. Also, of the two ladies, you can tell who is more merciful by seeing how they treat Ashitaka, who is the outsider. He is not part of this war. He is a human who lives in balance with nature. He is part of both worlds. Yet Princess Mononoke tells him to piss off when they first meet, while Lady Eboshi receives him, feeds him, seeks to hear his plight, and gives him shelter. Now she's not entirely doing this out of mercy, she's trying to see how she can use him, but it's a market exchange kind of thing which depends on his consent, and she is also willing to help him for free in many instances. This reminds us that civilization is more merciful than nature. We forget this when we see the vast number of homeless people living badly, but at least they are living. They'd be in much worse conditions out in the wilderness. We can't forget that. In the end, Eboshi is driven into the forest to kill the spirit of nature that lives there, a deity of life and death, and the conflict spirals out of control, but in the end, Ashitaka manages to avert total disaster. The essence of nature is encapsulated by the being known as the spirit of the forest, and it's through this being that we realize the true nature of this primordial war between the forest and Irontown. For one, the spirit of the forest operates by taking life from one being and giving life to another, as we can see when it heals Ashitaka, so it's not entirely benign. Nature is transactional, kind of like civilization. There is no free lunch. Also, it's highly indifferent to the carnage and destruction around it, and doesn't react at all against the humans except to take back its own head at the end. And even then, it just goes away after that and leaves the people who try to kill it alone. Throughout the whole thing, Ashitaka never takes a side, kind of like the spirit of the forest itself. Ashitaka understands that the real enemy is the curse that haunts him, and this curse is what haunts the whole world. And it's only by changing one's perspective to something higher, beyond this earthly thing, can then the war stop and the curse be lifted. James Cameron's Avatar, by comparison, is just self-hating and dishonest on the part of the filmmakers. Not only is its message absolutely vile, but it's sheer hypocrisy to have a movie trash-talking industrial society while producing massive numbers of useless plastic toys and merch on a massive industrial scale and cutting down countless trees to make these crappy posters. This is really just a whole other level of cynical exploitation of the zeitgeist done by Hollywood corporations, and it's really bad when you think about it. This is the truth about capitalism. Criticism and self-hatred is actually part of the capitalist system. Criticism of capitalism sells extremely well, which feeds capitalism itself. Likewise, hatred of humanity feeds the human ego. I'm not like the other humans because I hate them too, but that doesn't solve anything. In all seriousness, the idealization of the Na'vi and the jungle is just incredibly dishonest on part of James Cameron. It's like, okay Jimmy, may I call you Jimmy? If the Na'vi's way of life is so superior, why don't you go live in the jungle? How is your lifestyle anyway? Do you live in a giant mansion, Jimmy, by any chance? What's your carbon footprint, Jimmy? Comes across as a tad hypocritical, don't you think? Meanwhile, the message that Miyazaki is giving us is actually just common sense, because the humans and their way of life in the towns isn't demonized. It just says that we must live sustainably. One doesn't have to live in the jungle. Just buy a Tesla or something. I'm kidding. In Princess Mononoke, nature is not idealized and humanity not demonized. In fact, the whole point of that movie is how we have to try to dig deeper below the apparent superficial conflict of man versus nature. Things are actually not what they appear. You ever wonder why the spirit of the forest never fights back against humanity to protect nature? It has all this power, yet it seems aloof. It doesn't lift a finger to protect the animals fighting for their survival. Why? The animals themselves are shocked, flabbergasted, stupefied that the powerful spirit of the forest isn't doing anything to protect the natural order against the humans. But the truth is, the reason why the spirit of the forest isn't doing anything against human industrialization is actually because human industrialization is part of the natural order. What we are doing in building our stuff, harvesting resources, and killing and consuming animals in droves is actually perfectly natural, even if parasitic, because parasites are a part of nature. The irony of the human story is that we are nature destroying itself. Our voracious consumption of the earth is actually the most natural thing about us. Locusts eating a field. It's our impulse to devour. You can't get any more natural than that. And we're not the only animals that get out of balance and find ourselves in an environment that can't hold us back, and then we devour everything in sight. This happens literally all the time. People talk like animals are wiser than us, as they live in such balance with nature, like that time some hippie lady trained a gorilla to do sign language and tell us humans were stupid because of capitalism, and how animals were so much wiser for not driving SUVs or some shit.
I am Coco. I am Gorilla. Man, I love man. Man is stupid. It's time to hurry. Fix the earth. Help the earth.
It's like, bro, animals are not in balance with nature on purpose. The reason why animals are in balance with the ecosystem is because they are getting their asses kicked by greater forces which keep their population down, okay? Every animal on this planet would do the same thing in our position, and worse, because they wouldn't have the self-awareness to consciously try to hold back and stop themselves from consuming everything, and they certainly wouldn't adopt environmentalist policies. The bunnies rampaging across Australia didn't go all like, "How dare you, fellow bunnies? How dare you? We are harming the delicate balance of this ecosystem. That's why I'm not going to bunny school no more." This is the irony of the human condition. To save nature, we must be better than nature. We must rise above nature, our nature, to consume mindlessly. Then we will save nature from itself by saving it from us, from the peace of nature in us. And then we can be stewards of nature and watch over it and keep the balance. This is why the environmental message in The Lord of the Rings is not a cringe fest like an Avatar, and neither is the message of Princess Mononoke, because in their message there's a place for human civilization to live on this planet. The emphasis is on adopting a better perspective that cares for nature, not condemning technology and civilization as a whole and telling us all to wipe our asses with banana leaves. James Cameron is a Ted Kaczynski fan confirmed! Oh! Ironically, Princess Mononoke herself is similar to the Jake Sully character in Avatar, in that she is adopted by the beings of the forest, rejects humanity, and is willing to fight to the death against the industrialist ruler that is destroying the forests. Here's the thing though, as cool and badass as she is, and as understandable as her plight is, Princess Mononoke is wrong. Her position is not the right one. Her hatred of humanity is incorrect, and it's her relationship with Ashitaka that helps her grow as a person. That's why Ashitaka is the real hero of the story, because Jake and Mononoke's stance is misguided. This is because the true nature of this war between industry and the forest cannot be blamed on a single side, as Ashitaka learns. Why is Lady Eboshi pushing into the forest? Why is she so desperate to dig into the soil and harvest iron? Why is she so keen on developing new weapons of war that weaker women can use in combat? Why is Eboshi such a ruthless killer? Why is she so cold and calculating all the time? It's because she'll get slaughtered if she isn't like that. She invaded the forest because her own lands are being invaded by an enemy force. She is taking the lands of others so that she can gather enough resources to then defend her own lands from her own invaders. She is being pushed into the forest. She is caught in a cycle of violence and hatred, and she is the product of that. She is trying to survive, and she is trying to help poor women and diseased lepers survive. She is not a monster, not more than the wolves are. She is just part of the food chain, and she would rather be the predator than the prey. And that's the source of the violence. The food chain, in other words, nature. The spirit of the forest is a force of life and death. He is the cycle of life and death, and that's why he changes forms from night to day, and why he only heals you if you give him a living thing to kill. Living things survive by devouring and hunting and killing each other, and that's why the spirit of the forest isn't doing anything against the encroaching humans, because it's all part of the cycle, bro. Nothing that's happening here is an aberration to nature. Lady Eboshi is just another apex predator, like the wolves themselves. So from the spirit's perspective, having her prowl around between the trees is just business as usual if you think about it. And human industry is just another product of evolution. Lady Eboshi is just a highly evolved predator fighting the former top dogs of the forest, which were the wolves. Now, that being said, the humans are getting too greedy and the cycle of violence is getting out of hand, which leads to Lady Eboshi and the Imperial Agent guy wanting to kill the forest spirit, which would basically wipe out all life, including humans, so it's a stupid thing to do. Which is where Ashitaka comes in. He wants to try and transcend the cycle of violence, even though he's part of the food chain like every other living being. But he is still applying reason and a higher sense of spiritual purpose to try and decrease the violence and make everything reach a balance that includes the humans. But Ashitaka is not blindly subject to nature's laws. He has a vision of a possibility beyond the cycle of violence, of life and death. He is cursed with the poison of hatred and the need to kill, to take, and if it ever overtakes him, he will die after killing those around him. But so is the whole world in a similar curse. And he believes it's possible to move beyond that. That's why his quest is to see with eyes unclouded by hate. Lady Eboshi is too caught up in the natural and material world, which is why she laughs at Ashitaka when he confesses to her his quest. She doesn't believe it's possible. And when the story ends, and there's this melancholy to it because the conflict isn't really resolved, it's just slowed down. Because the conflict between living beings is a part of nature. It will never really stop. The best one can do is to try to see with eyes unclouded by hate and slow down the cycle of violence, so it doesn't spiral out of control. And even Ashitaka, the diplomat who wants peace, is forced to threaten the Imperial Agent guy at the end with death, when he's all like, "Don't make me kill you." And he reaches that point because it's necessary to stop the other guy before his greed engulfs the whole world with death. And yeah, the main problem in Princess Mononoke is human greed. The emperor wants to live forever, so he wants to take the spirit's head, and his insane greed is a looming shadow that sets things spiraling out of control. While in Avatar, the main problem is also human greed, and Avatar does acknowledge that killing to sustain life is inevitable, and that the key is not to take more than you need, so as not to disrupt the delicate balance, which is why the Na'vi are hunters, but they only hunt to feed themselves, which is why they are much better than the humans, who kill animals to make blue jeans and shit. The issue, though, is that greed is natural, and the will to hold back and not take as much as you can is not natural. It's a transcendent wisdom beyond nature itself. And Avatar has this over-idealized view of nature, while Princess Mononoke, as a movie, knows the brutality and harshness of nature, as even the animals are quite brutal. And the story itself starts with a forest demon attacking an innocent human settlement. Most importantly, however, Avatar unilaterally pins the blame on humanity, as if humanity isn't the evolutionary result of this natural cycle of violence, and the Na'vi and nature in general are all good and never do anything wrong. In Princess Mononoke, the animals aren't even morally perfect. They too fall out of balance just as much as the humans do and become demonic entities that spread corruption. You know, when they're all like, blah, 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 and they have like this plague thing going. The animals have to fight very hard to not fall into that corruption. It's not all, well, actually, human beings are the problem. They're like a cancer, a disease on the planet. Yeah, your capitalist ways are the problem. Now buy my shitty merch and be good consumers. I myself have criticized industrial capitalism for its excesses in other videos, and I am indeed a supporter of environmental causes. And I despise pollution and extreme consumerism, where we clutter the world with cheap plastic craps like toys of the Na'vi, for instance. How many garbage dumps are cluttered with these things? Huh, Jimmy? Huh, Jimmy? But I don't think technological civilization is the problem, and I do not want to live in the jungle, much less use cutting-edge tech to make an anti-technology movie with state-of-the-art special effects. Yeah, the artificial world of mankind is a dying world. The jungle is where it's at. That's why we built this artificial jungle for you guys to enjoy in air-conditioned theaters. Princess Mononoke isn't like that at all, and understands the real causes of the violence. Attack on Titan 2, by the way, which I discussed in a video whose link I'll provide. The Japanese seem way more in touch with reality than hypocritical Hollywood boomers, who say that I'm the problem as a Western man, even though they are obscenely rich off the system they criticize, and I am not. But it's interesting how the notion of the world being cruel or cursed is something that we see again and again in Japanese media, even in popular video games like Dark Souls, where the way that natural forces are set up brings tragedy in the world. Which is ironic because Japanese stories are more similar to Christianity's view of this being a fallen world, and that the world is cursed. I think the Japanese have this similarity because this worldview is pre-modern and more common throughout several cultures, while the West has adopted Rousseau's noble savage, nature is a paradise bullcrap. Japanese media is correct though, the world is in fact cursed. Part 3. The world is cursed.
You! All of this is because of you! Thank God we're here as the enlightened path to show you that it's you.
These days, there are angry ghosts all around us, dead from wars, sickness, starvation, and nobody cares. So you say you're under a curse? Well, so what? So's the whole damn world.
Does that right hand of yours wish to kill me now, Ashitaka?
If it would lift the curse, I'd let it tear you apart. But even that wouldn't end the killing now, would it?
Look, everyone! This is what hatred looks like. This is what it does when it catches hold of you.
The world is cursed because the way that it's set up rewards violent behavior in the short term and often puts living beings in a position where they are forced to fight to survive. None of this justifies atrocities, and none of this means that evil is necessary, because Ashitaka's quest of transcending the curse is also a real possibility, and it's something we humans have started to accomplish as we reduced violence among ourselves and are also working to reduce pollution and live sustainably so we don't destroy the world parasitically. Although violence is returning, unfortunately, because historical cycles are a pain in our collective buttocks. But with the world being cursed, does mean, however, is that you can't just blame one side of a conflict and you can't just idealize the other. Because even the victimizer is a victim, and even the victim is a victimizer. Ashitaka and his village were the victims of a demonic giant wild boar, i.e. nature, who was the victim of Lady Eboshi, who in turn is the victim of Lord Asano in the movie, and on it goes. Ashitaka's wisdom is his intent to at least slow the violence down so as to prevent everyone from destroying each other, and that's why he's the real hero, unlike Jake Sully. Jake never tried to see with eyes unclouded by hate, so Jake was just part of the problem, part of this terrible cycle of violence. And now for my final argument, so I can finally prove once and for all just how superior Princess Mononoke is to James Cameron's derivative and poorly thought out schlock. Princess Mononoke is so good that it crams in a lot of complex information about history and the way of civilizations and man's relationship to nature in just 2 hours. Meanwhile, Avatar is almost 3 hours long, and it's so simplistic to the point of adolescent naivete, and it's much worse than Pocahontas. Even Disney could do a better job than Jimmy Cameron. Which brings me to the European invasion of the Americas. Now this is important, because Avatar perpetuates the same BS narrative that we normally hear, you know. Long ago, everyone lived in harmony, but everything changed when the colonizer attacked. Is this kind of storyline the legal obligation for any franchise named Avatar? This is total bullshit though. Don't get me wrong, I actually like Avatar, the real one, with crazy waifus and the emo boys doing martial arts. But this false narrative is at the core of real-world hatred, like the hatred between the Eritreans and the Ethiopians, or all of Asia and Japan, but especially, with reference to Avatar, the self-hatred from historically illiterate white people, or the hatred between those from European ancestry towards those from a non-European background, and vice versa, but especially the relationship between those of European descent with those of Native American ancestry. This is indeed a very heavy topic, and we often use art to contemplate and reflect on this aspect of the human experience, right? Conflict and war between different cultures, different populations of people. The amazing thing is that Miyazaki's Princess Mononoke actually is more applicable in its message to the conflict between those of European ancestry and those of Native American ancestry than Avatar from James Cameron. Because like Lady Eboshi being pushed into the forest by Lord Asano, the Europeans were pushed westward by a very powerful empire from the east. An empire that relentlessly tried conquering Europe and actually managed to conquer many European lands. I am talking about, of course, the Ottoman Empire. They launched several relentless attacks against Europe and were barely held off in several desperate battles. There is in fact historical connection between the Ottomans conquering the Hagia Sophia and turning it into a mosque, and the Spaniards conquering the Aztec temples and building churches over them. It's a cascade effect, like the Chinese fighting off nomadic peoples to the north, which then causes a series of migration pressures that led to the Huns invading Rome. History is indeed very connected, with groups often suffering the consequences of a conflict that happened thousands of kilometers away, which is what we see brilliantly happening with Ashitaka at the start of his movie, you know. The conflict in the forest with Lady Eboshi leads to that forest god rampaging like a beast and then attacking Ashitaka, and then that brings him into the conflict. But in the case of the Ottoman Turks and the Native Americans, the connection is actually very obvious, and I can't believe that more people don't really talk about it. For one thing, the Europeans started sailing towards India to access the markets there because the Ottomans blocked the land routes leading to the Asian markets as a kind of economic warfare to impoverish Europe and make it easier to conquer, as they famously kept trying to sail to Asia, right, all the time, and then they found the Americas. Also, famous Europeans who pioneered European conquest of the Americas, people like Cortez and John Smith, also fought the Ottoman Turks in their lifetimes. John Smith went to fight them to defend Europe and was actually enslaved by the Ottomans and turned into a sex slave and sold to an older rich Greek lady before he met the tribe of Pocahontas on the other side of the world. He led a crazy life, by the way. I suggest you guys read the link I'll post in the description that describes his adventures. The dude was a badass. And Cortez, who conquered the Aztecs, actually had to return to the Mediterranean years later after conquering the Aztecs so that he could fight the Ottomans in sea battles to defend Spain from the encroachment of the Ottomans, who were threatening to invade Spain from their bases in Algeria.
It was becoming clear that the Ottoman holdings in North Africa would remain an easy staging ground for the invasions of Spain and Italy, so Charles decided to conquer the region. It was led by Charles himself, with the likes of Andrea Doria, the Duke of Alba, and the conqueror of the Aztec Empire, Hernán Cortés, commanding his 40,000-strong army.
As horrible as what I'm about to say may sound, it does seem to be the case that colonizing the Americas may have saved Europe from being conquered and being colonized in its own way by the Ottomans, and thus being enslaved themselves. Because extracting the resources from the Americas made places like Spain and Portugal economically powerful enough to build up massive fleets and armies capable of defeating the Ottomans and stopping their advance into Christendom. Sci-fi stories involving aliens and invasions are often childish in their narrative simplicity. It's either aliens invading humans, like in Halo, or humans invading aliens, like in Avatar. While real history would be more like Master Chief harassing the Na'vi to forcibly harvest up uranium or whatever it's called to fuel humanity's defenses against the Covenant, who are trying to destroy human civilization. Moral judgments are a little more complicated in this scenario, right? At least more than James Cameron's boomer take on the evil corporations going all money, 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 money. And it goes far beyond the Ottomans. Like I stated in my Attack on Titan video, the Spanish, who first started colonizing the Americas successfully, since the Vikings failed at it, had just gone through the longest war in human history, where they had been invaded by the North African Moors for almost 800 years. And they were constantly raided to be enslaved. And this had turned them incredibly paranoid, and everything they did was seen through the light of fighting off Islamic invaders. Columbus himself convinced the Spanish crown to fund the expedition that discovered the Americas by saying that it would help fight off the Moors. The Spaniards believed themselves justified in all their conquests because they saw themselves as victims fighting an all-encompassing Islamic enemy that was everywhere, and if they didn't expand their territory, they would be conquered. That's how they saw it, which was kind of true, but the Spaniards were overly paranoid, which is why Cortés thought he saw Islamic mosques in Mexico as he conquered the Aztecs. They were just Mesoamerican temples, but the Spanish saw Muslims everywhere, in every shadow, the trauma of war. And the Muslims themselves should not be demonized. They were also brutally invaded by the Mongols, who treated them horribly and even threw corpses infected with the Black Plague into Kaffa to infect the Muslims there. And Europe was also affected by this, because the corpses thrown by the Mongols infected Italian merchant ships, which fled back to Europe and caused a chain reaction of the Black Death that killed 1/3 of the European population. The bodies were so much that there wasn't any room in the cemeteries, so they piled up the bones to make Christian churches purely out of the bones, like in Kutna Hora in the Czech Republic. I've actually been there personally, by the way. It's the most metal place on the planet. It's like a bone church. By the way, the Mongol tactic of throwing infected corpses as bioweapons, which then devastated Europe, is reminiscent to the horrific smallpox blankets incident that the British tried doing, but actually in that case, the effectiveness is unknown and there's no evidence that it actually worked from what I could find, but the infection of the natives with smallpox was overwhelmingly done by accident from what we can tell. But my point with this, bringing up these tragedies and discussing these tragedies, is that everything the Europeans dished out on other people, they also received before so. And despite the Mongols and the European colonizers trying these awful tactics, the lesson here is that nature itself seems to be the worst killer of all. The presence of these diseases are a testament to how brutal nature can be, and Avatar's naive idealization of nature reeks of a sheltered child syndrome. Meanwhile, Princess Mononoke makes a reference to diseases and the whole demonic infestation thing that likens diseases to the plague of war and hatred. War infects everyone in a cycle of hatred, and Ashitaka is a plague victim, and his hope is to be cured by curing himself from hatred, which is brilliant. Princess Mononoke brilliantly encapsulates human tragedy and the experience of war and violence in just 2 hours. Like I said, Ashitaka's plague is reminiscent of the smallpox that the natives suffered through, the Black Death that the Europeans suffered through. Lady Eboshi being invaded by Lord Asano is like the Muslims being invaded by the Mongols, pushing them west against Europe, and the Europeans being pushed west on the Americas through the invasion in turn. And this cycle of death and plague and violence and everyone getting greedy as well and trying to get more than what they should get, wanting more than what they should want. And the only way out of all this mess and all this violence is Ashitaka's quest, which should be all our quests, no matter who we are or what our ethnicity is. The quest to see with eyes unclouded by hate. What the Europeans did to the natives was not justified. It was not justified, despite the whole cycle of violence. And if humans were wiser, the Europeans could have devised other ways to withstand the harsh reality of the world and not make it worse. However, hating the Europeans is also not justified, because the hatred itself is the problem, and the Europeans, like Lady Eboshi and the people of Irontown, were also victims, trying to survive in a world that is cursed. And Jake Sully is a misguided character who abandoned his diplomatic purpose to take a side in the violence instead of being like Ashitaka and trying to bring peace on all sides. It is indeed wonderful that we live in an era where demonizing the Native Americans as inherent savages is seen as wrong, because it is wrong. But many of us are still not seeing with eyes unclouded by hate. They just start hating the Europeans as being the real savages. I speak this from personal experience. I've seen people do this, including family members. I do believe in the importance of preserving the Native American, Native Brazilian heritage, their languages, their communities. And I know that understanding how badly we treated the natives and coming to terms with it so as not to repeat the same mistakes of the past is incredibly important. In fact, it was our past pride and arrogance in our delusion of inherent superiority that made us disillusioned with our own culture and traditions in the first place, when we realized that we weren't all that we were crept up to be because we were doing very awful things. But hating ourselves is the irrational response to our own evil, because if we see ourselves as the evil ones, then that justifies violence against ourselves. And isn't that what we were trying to avoid in the first place? This is what bothers me about Jake Sully killing the other humans by the end of Avatar. It's a total chaos and totally unnecessary, and it's just not a good message. And Ashitaka is the real hero. The native peoples and cultures were also just human. Many indigenous cultures were indeed peaceful and amazingly gentle, like the Moriori in New Zealand. Others not so much, like the Maori, who almost exterminated the Moriori. Western self-hatred and idealization of the native peoples is perfectly encapsulated in this clip.
Scholars had resorted to a wishful thinking that spoke more eloquently of their own times than those of the Maya.
From the period of the 1930s up through the 60s, the great scholars of the time, Morley, Thompson, and others, the picture that was drawn of the Maya is that they never had war, they never disagreed with each other, and one wonders how they got close enough to each other even to reproduce themselves through the common human means.
People clung to that idea tenaciously, and I think part of the reason for that is they were reacting to all of the excesses and the maladies of Western culture. You have to remember that their context was that of 2 world wars, where literally the whole world was involved in a deadly conflict.
They wanted a peaceful people. They wanted to know that someplace in the world there was a human community that lived without war and competition.
Again, my point here is not to criticize the natives. Very much to the contrary. My point is that we are all human, and it's not right to make caricatures of their culture and legacy for our own political BS like Avatar does. They deserve more respect than to be warped into a utopian fantasy. However, there is nothing wrong with films like El Dorado or Pocahontas, which are of course cartoons, but actually have a more nuanced portrayal of the natives and their relationship to Europeans, and actually emphasizes cooperation and peace and understanding between ethnicities. We are all capable of hate, and we all need to cure ourselves of this hate. Princess Mononoke is morally superior to Avatar and a better message in today's world, because we should be like Ashitaka in his quest of seeing the world with eyes unclouded by hate, not like Jake Sully, who is part of the violence. That idiot just changed sides and thinks that makes a difference, but it doesn't. The cycle of violence continues. Ashitaka's quest of minimizing the violence and trying to see all sides with eyes unclouded by hate should be all our quests. And if we don't succeed at this, then we continue to hate each other, even if it's hating ourselves, I think we will all die a painful death of nuclear hellfire or even unleash a highly advanced bioweapon or some shit. The more we advance technologically, the more Ashitaka's quest becomes urgent. And this is why anime is better than Hollywood garbage. Call me a weep, I don't care. Please like and subscribe if you like what I do. And a shout of gratitude to my patrons. If you think differently and if you wish to open my horizons with rational and well thought out arguments, I will read and I will be open to seeing things from your perspective. And I'd like to thank everyone who suggested for me to do this comparison between Princess Mononoke and Avatar. Thank you all for listening to my ramblings. Have a good day, my friends.